as it is taught by Joel Dipamkara Sri Jana in his Lamp for the Path, he describes whoever it is that uses methods in order to avoid rebirth in the lower realms, to take rebirth as to strive for samsaric happiness. That type of being is the lowest type of being, the being of small scope. So there are sort of different levels or stages in which we train, beginning with the first kind of level of striving for a good rebirth, and then the kind of middling level of Dharma, and finally the sort of being of greatest capacity. But that kind of being who is striving to take a good rebirth within the five or six types of samsaric rebirths, who is striving for that happiness alone, in the way that we continuously take rebirth in samsara. One goes from being, say, an animal and then is born as a human. One has to continue to take up these aggregates, and that kind of cycle of taking rebirth is what we call samsara. We can also refer to these aggregates that are taken due to the force of karma and the afflictions as samsara itself. But the being of small capacity is one who knows this kind of unmistaken method in order to take a good rebirth. They avoid the 10 non-virtuous actions, anything that is harmful to others, with the kind of goal of gaining a good rebirth in the future. So this is the kind of training of a being of small capacity, one who is striving for their own samsaric happiness alone. And for that purpose, they know the kind of methods that they need to train in, the sort of unmistaken methods of avoiding those kinds of things that harm others and engaging in positive, virtuous actions for the sake of a good rebirth in the future. So that type of training, that type of being is the being of small capacity. And this is where we need to begin. So then, whereas the being of small capacity is striving for a good rebirth within samsara, going beyond that, the being of middling capacity is thinking about getting free from samsara altogether. So the kind of lowest level of practice is to abandon harming others and engage in the 10 virtuous actions in order to avoid rebirth in the lower realms. A being of that type is striving for a kind of samsaric happiness. That's what they want, is a good rebirth as a human or a god. But a being of middling capacity kind of turns their back on the sufferings of samsara, or even the pleasures of samsara, recognizing that they are not stable. They are in the nature of suffering. Even being born as a human or a god, that is not stable. You experience some kind of contaminated, temporary kind of happiness, but in the end, that's still in the nature of suffering. So a being of small capacity is still striving for something that is within samsara, whereas a being of middling capacity turns their back, kind of turns away from those contaminated karmas, those contaminated actions, and instead makes an effort at their own peace, their own freedom, liberation from that cycle of having to take rebirth and experience birth, aging, and sickness and death, and so forth. So a being of middling capacity is looking beyond the kinds of contaminated pleasures of samsara, instead to a state of peace, to a state of freedom from that cycle of uncontrolled rebirth. Being of middling capacity to the being of great capacity, one recognizes that all sentient beings are just like you in not wanting to suffer and wanting to have happiness. And so recognizing that it's not right to strive for your own liberation alone. Instead, you want to find a way to be able to benefit all sentient beings, to be able to actually lead them to that kind of state of freedom from their suffering. So although we are not in the position to be able to do that all right now, beginning with the trainings of the being of small capacity and continuing into the being of middling capacity, we should think we're going to attain that kind of state of Buddhahood for ourselves, strive to get to that place wherein one has removed all faults and attained all good qualities, and is thus able to be able to benefit all sentient beings in this way. So here, continuing in Atisha's Lamp for the Path, he describes the being of great capacity or superior capacity as a bodhisattva who's not just striving for their own peace and freedom from suffering, but is instead striving to attain that for all sentient beings, wanting to place them in that state of liberation. So here, generally, when we talk about the sort of being or a person of the three types of small, middling, and great capacity, here, generally, this word being or person is referring to the Sanskrit word as Purusha. And it's really someone who is endowed with the kind of capacity, with the ability. So here, as a human, taking the kind of life that we have the ability to think beyond just this life, to think about our future kind of happiness and work for that. So here, this word being has the kind of sense, I mean, that's what I'm using in English, but it has the sense of one who has the capacity, has the ability. So we have the ability, beginning with the path of small scope, to think beyond just sort of feeding and clothing ourselves in this life, and instead thinking about our future lives. So here, when we talk about the kind of being of different capacities, that being has the sense of having the ability, having the capacity. So here, as it's explained, according to Atisha's lamp for the path, we talk about these three types of beings, small, middling, and great capacity. But here, they're all really one or like sort of branches, parts of the same kind of path. To be able to do the Mahayana, the path of the being of great capacity, we have to have done those paths for the being of small capacity and middling capacity. So from the point of thinking about the preciousness of our human rebirth, having this kind of rebirth with the leisures and endowments to be able to practice, and thereby getting rid of those kinds of non-virtuous actions that would lead to a lower rebirth, cultivating the kind of causes for a good rebirth. We then proceed into the kind of practices necessary in order to gain definite freedom from this cycle of suffering, getting rid of the causes of our continued rebirth within samsara. They're all branches, they're all part of attaining Buddhahood. You can't sort of skip over some of them in order to be able to get to the higher one. So here, it's like when we are going through various levels of school, we have to proceed through various grade levels in order to get to the higher one. They're not sort of like separate paths headed in different ways, but rather all part of one path. And so when we are looking at the kind of Dharma that we need to practice, we need to practice that kind of Dharma that allows us to avoid rebirth in the lower realms, the kind of being of small capacities Dharma, in order to then be able to look at the 12 links of dependent origination, see how it is that we have continued rebirth, and then strive to attain a kind of liberation or freedom from that. And then finally, we can enter into the path of the great vehicle, the Mahayana. But we all have to practice them, to go through them in this kind of sequence. We shouldn't see them again as like separate paths headed in different ways, or that we don't need the kind of being of the trainings for the being of small capacity, because that's just for the small capacity. It's all a branch or a part of leading to Buddhahood, of getting to Buddhahood. And so thereby we should recognize the importance of practicing these in sequence for that kind of final goal, that ultimate goal, being a good rebirth. And one recognizes that it is the Buddha who is the one who teaches the methods by which we are able to accomplish that kind of a goal. We're able to avoid rebirth in the lower realms, and we're able to gain a good rebirth, a qualified rebirth, where we can continue to practice the Dharma if we act according to the kind of advice that the Buddha has taught. So it's again like we have a bad illness and we seek out a really qualified doctor, and that doctor gives us that kind of advice. What do we need to do to recover? What do we need to do for our health in order to get better from this illness? Then we have to actually take up that medicine. We have to take our medicine in order to get better from that, whatever illness it is. And so for the sake of avoiding rebirth in the lower realms, for the sake of gaining a good, fully qualified rebirth where we can continue to practice the Dharma, one needs to put these kinds of methods into practice according to the kinds of teachings on karma given by the Buddha, for the sake of gaining a particular result. We see, oh, I need to abandon harming other sentient beings. I need to work to benefit them as much as I am able to. And so again, this is like when we hear advice from a doctor or we are given medicine from them, we have to actually take it up into practice. We have to take our medicine or do the kind of things that they tell us in order to recover. And so here, this is like when we go for refuge to the Dharma. We recognize the Buddha as being the one who has taught these methods, but the Dharma is really what we have to do to accomplish a good rebirth. When we say, I go for refuge to the Dharma, it's really going for refuge to those methods that the Buddha has taught, that they are going to accomplish those kinds of results for us. And for the sake of attaining that kind of goal, whether it's for the being of small capacity, a good rebirth in the future, by practicing the kind of methods. So here, when one goes for refuge to the Sangha, it's really recognizing those beings who are striving in the same path by practicing generosity and patience and so forth, like a community, those friends who are similarly practicing the same kind of a path. They are one's community, one's refuge in that way. So here, moving beyond the path of being of small capacity, looking at the path of a being of middling capacity, they go for refuge again with this recognition in the Buddha's ability to protect them as well as the Dharma. But here they recognize that even if you are born as a human or a god, you're not beyond the kinds of sufferings of samsara. Taking rebirth uncontrolled due to the force of karma and the afflictions is what one would really like to get out of. And the Buddha is the one who teaches these kinds of methods. So having confidence, having that kind of faith and trust in the teachings of the Buddhas as being a refuge, being the methods by which one is able to get out of samsara, one places one's trust that in this kind of path, lifetime after lifetime, you're going to strive in order to accomplish the Dharma, accomplish those methods. And in the case of a being of middling capacity, it is getting rid of those afflictions, in particular, the kind of attachment and animosity that arise from this grasping at an I. So long as we have this grasping at an I, we give rise to all of these various afflictions. And really, we have to be our own kind of witness to this. No one else can really see in our minds and see what sort of afflictions that we have. But this I, this self, appears to us as if it existed sort of independently from its own side, without any sort of dependence upon our thinking or any kind of contingency. And in reality, when we search among this basis of designation, all of our various aggregates, we can't find such an I. But when we grasp at it, when we apprehend it to exist in that way, we then give rise to attachment for our own side. We have the sense of mine and a sense of other, and thereby give rise to attachment and aversion. And that is what causes us to then continue to cycle in samsara as we create karma out of that attachment and animosity. So as the Buddha has explained, it is that grasping at an I that we fundamentally need to eliminate. And so having that kind of confidence in the Buddha as the one who teaches this, the Dharma as the methods by which one is able to overcome this, again, like the example of a doctor and taking the medicine, it is then the way in which one goes for refuge is by following those kinds of methods, by looking at the Buddha again as the teacher, the Dharma as the methods that we actually have to implement, and the Sangha as those that are sort of our friends, our companions along this path. In this case, the being of middling capacity are those training in the understanding of selflessness that is able to eliminate this grasping at an I and the kind of attachment and aversion that come from that. So the kind of thought of refuge for a being of great capacity who's trying to practice the Mahayana, they contemplate that it's not just me who is suffering within samsara, but it is all sentient beings who are suffering in that way. In the same way that I don't want to suffer even in the slightest and want to have happiness and am never really satisfied with happiness, so too are all other sentient beings in that same kind of situation. So just wanting my own kind of peace, wanting my own liberation from samsara is not right. I rather should want to free all sentient beings. And in order to be able to do that, I myself need to become a Buddha, need to attain that state in which I've eliminated all faults and obtained all good qualities in order to be able to really help other sentient beings come to that kind of state. And so for that sake, I need to look at the teachings of the Buddha and practice them, implement the kind of wisdom side of generating this wisdom, realizing selflessness, as well as engaging in the method side of practicing the various perfections, practicing bodhicitta, love and compassion over a long period of time, in order to be able to fully develop them into that state of Buddhahood, wherein one is able to actually benefit other sentient beings to the fullest. So again, I'm looking at the Buddha as the one who gives those kinds of advice and instructions, and the Dharma as those things to be practiced, love and compassion and bodhicitta and the wisdom and so forth. And then one looks to those who are bodhisattvas, those who are practicing as well those kinds of similar paths. You look to rely upon them as friends or companions in one's journey. So here, the Dharma that I am explaining here is the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, or the Way of the Bodhisattva, this 9th chapter, which deals with the wisdom, realizing selflessness. Now, for the being of small capacity, in order to gain a good rebirth as a human or a god, in order to avoid rebirths in the lower realms, one doesn't need to develop this wisdom realizing selflessness. But in order to attain one's own liberation or to attain Buddhahood, then one needs to develop this kind of understanding of selflessness. Although we can see like there are methods to, say, temporarily avert attachment by looking at the faults of it, or looking at the benefits of patience in order to be able to temporarily get rid of one's anger, for example. We can see those kinds of sort of temporary methods by which we can alleviate or reduce our various afflictions. But to completely eliminate them from their root, we need to develop this wisdom realizing selflessness. So it is the root of all of these faults is this grasping at an autonomous kind of an I or a self. And while it is the case that we can sort of, based upon our contemplation of the benefits of something or the faults of something else, create temporary kind of reduction in our anger or in our attachment, to really get at them, get at the root of all of those kinds of afflictions, our anger, our animosity, and so forth, we need to address this grasping at an I, grasping at a self. And it is the wisdom realizing selflessness that is able to counteract that. So here again, when it comes to then the being a middling capacity who wants their own liberation, as well as the great vehicle in Mahayana, these both need this realization of selflessness. Now here, actually, when we talk about those that are striving either for their own liberation or for the state of Buddhahood, we can talk about like 3 levels of enlightenment based upon 3 vehicles, 3 sort of paths that are traveled. One is the hearer vehicle, and then there is the solitary realizer vehicle, and then the bodhisattva vehicle. So one can imagine the sort of differences between them. Hearers and solitary realizers are only striving for their own liberation. Now, a hearer is someone who, based upon hearing some teachings, then engages in practice, and they really don't have the kind of mental fortitude to think about practicing over eons, let alone like hundreds of lives, but rather they want to really get out of samsara quickly. They have a strong desire to be freed from the suffering of samsara, and so they want to get out as quickly as possible in 2 or 3 lives. And so it's like we could think about having like a kitchen. If you have a kitchen where you just have the bare necessities, that's sort of like what a hearer has. They have the most kind of bare bones ingredients to be able to cook up what they need. And then you proceed to the kind of again, a hearer is thinking mainly about themselves and getting rid of attachment and animosity and all of those kinds of attitudes for their own liberation from samsara primarily. There's really not a sort of vast or extensive path, but the most expedient route, the quickest way to get to that kind of liberation. And then you have a solitary realizer. This is someone who is more solitary from society. They're not, you can see people like that who tend to go off and sort of contemplate for themselves. And these, whereas hearers tend to be sort of more within society, solitary realizers, they sort of get what they need and then engage in their practice aside from society. They engage in more extensive kind of contemplation to gain a higher result than the hearer's vehicle. And then when it comes to the bodhisattva vehicle, this is where someone is striving to attain a state of Buddhahood, a state in which all faults faults have been removed and all good qualities have been attained, no matter how long it might take. Of course, they have a strong desire to work for the benefit of others, to gain that state where they can fully work for the benefit of others. But there's not really this sense of how long it might take. There's no concern with how long it might take. They're going to be helping other beings along the way, working for the benefit of others. And they don't see it as something that's like a burden or a responsibility, but rather this is something that they are continuously striving in joyfully and wanting to do. So all three of these vehicles, the hearer, the solitary realizer, and the bodhisattva, depend upon a realization of selflessness in order to get to their desired aim. Although the kind of reasoning, the extent of the reasoning that goes into it varies between these different. So one trains the mind in the kind of trainings for the being of small capacity, and then those of the being of middling capacity, and finally those of the being of great capacity. And it's with that kind of motivation that we should listen to the teachings, thinking that I'm going to engage sequentially in these various trainings, lifetime after lifetime, no matter how long it may take, in order to get to that state of Buddhahood. So even if we're not able to practice everything immediately, doing in this way puts down strong imprints of these practices. And this is the kind of intention we really are, it's more beneficial to listen with that positive kind of motivation than to just sort of listen however, to put that sort of positive motivation forward makes the kind of imprints, the kind of practice that we do that much more powerful. So here, then, to get to the text, and here for the English, I'm using a Padmakara translation. There are many different translations that may vary slightly. So here it begins with a verse that reads, "All these branches of the doctrine, the enlightened sage expounded for the sake of wisdom. Therefore, they must cultivate this wisdom who wish to have an end of suffering." So we who want freedom from suffering for ourselves and want freedom from suffering for others, want them to get out of samsara, we have to then cultivate this kind of wisdom realizing selflessness. So here, a bodhisattva who wants to free self and others, it's indispensable that they cultivate this kind of wisdom, because in order to eliminate that beginningless ignorance, which is the source of all of our troubles, all of our suffering, one needs to cultivate the proper antidote to that, the wisdom realizing selflessness. So all of the branches of the doctrine, all of the teachings on the earlier 5 perfections that came before, beginning with generosity and so forth, these are taught for the sake of being able to generate this wisdom realizing selflessness. Again, the Buddha taught all of these things in order that beings be liberated from their sufferings, in order that he be able to help other beings free themselves from suffering. And thus, the methods are all for that sake of developing then this wisdom realizing selflessness, which is the way to get rid of our sufferings. So here there are some kind of doubts that arise regarding the realization of emptiness here. According to some of the various tenet schools, in particular like the Sutra school, the mind-only school as well, and the Vaibhashikas or the particularists, and also the middle way autonomists or the Svatantrikas. So all of the kind of lower schools don't think that one needs to realize subtle selflessness or emptiness in order to be freed from samsara, but in order to gain one's own liberation alone, the state of a hearer or a solitary realizer, one needs to realize the person's lack of being a self-sufficient, substantially existent entity. This is a kind of different level of selflessness. According to their presentation, like there are the 4 sort of characteristics of the First Noble Truth, being impermanence, suffering, selfless, and emptiness. And here, what they are identifying as selflessness is the person's lacking being a self-sufficient, substantially existent entity. And so they would say, in order to gain the kind of liberation, your own liberation, the state of an arhat, from practicing the hearer, the solitary realizer vehicle, that one does not need to realize subtle selflessness, to realize emptiness. But according to the Prasangika school, the consequentialist school, following after the teachings of Nagarjuna, wherein he he has said, it is often quoted that so long as there is grasping at the aggregates, there's going to be grasping at the I. And so long as we have that grasping at the I, that what is called the view of the perishable collection, there will be continued rebirth in samsara. So as he identifies that it is this subtle grasping at a self, this more subtle level, that is what leads to continued rebirth in samsara. So to gain any level of freedom from this kind of cycle of rebirth, one necessarily needs to realize emptiness. This is the special sort of characteristic of the Prasangika school, again, following after the teachings of Nagarjuna. In particular, as is often quoted, this verse from Precious Garland, wherein he says that so long as there's grasping at the aggregates, there's grasping at an I. And so long as there's that view of the perishable, that's what we call this grasping at an I, there's going to be continued rebirth in samsara. So for any level of liberation, one necessarily needs to realize emptiness. So again, here, as Nagarjuna says, so long as we grasp at these aggregates, we have our 5 aggregates, again, of consciousness and feelings, discrimination, karmic formations, and our form. And as long as we sort of grasp at those as being really, truly existent, they appear to us as though they were as though there was somehow like an independent, really, truly existent I. And as long as we grasp at that I to exist in that way, then there's no way, as long again as we grasp at these aggregates to exist in that way, there's no way we can get rid of that grasping at an I that somehow is something that is merely designated on those aggregates but appears to exist within them somehow. And again, we call this the view of the perishable, because really when we look at the collection of these things upon which we designate the I or the self, they're just like a collection of things that are constantly disintegrating, moment to moment, perishing or disintegrating. And so we have this sense that there's like an I that is autonomous, that exists in its own right, that is somehow like able to exist from its own side. But in some ways, there are many different ways in which we can perceive such an I or a self. In some ways, like a more coarse form, it's like if we were to set aside all of our aggregates, there would be some sort of like an I or a person, a self that were still there that we could point to as existing in this way. And all the ways that we view this I or this self is mistaken. We like when we talk about someone existing, or someone like, oh, I'm reading this book, oh, I'm eating, I'm walking, I'm doing these various things, we can speak about those coherently. But if you look for something to point to as though there were some autonomous person, autonomous act of walking, act of eating, something like that, there's nothing that one can actually point to. They don't exist in the way that they appear to us. So long as we hold to this idea that the aggregates are truly existent, and then based upon that we grasp at a truly existent I or self, then we will continue to accumulate various karma and thereby continue to take rebirth within samsara. So here, this is the kind of position of Nagarjuna. Again, as long as we have grasping at the aggregates, so too we will have grasping at that I, that kind of view of the perishable collection. And this is the same sort of viewpoint from which Shantideva, the master here, is teaching. He's teaching from that same kind of understanding of what it is to realize emptiness, what the realization of selflessness entails. So here, turning to the text, again, the first verse says here, all these branches of the doctrine the enlightened sage expounded for the sake of wisdom. Therefore, they must cultivate wisdom who wish to have an end of suffering. So here, this first half of the verse could be understood as kind of like a transitional verse. All that was taught in the previous 8th chapter dealing with meditative concentration, in particular, attaining meditative concentration or calm abiding, all of that was taught for the sake of then being able to develop special insight. So it is based upon attaining calm abiding that one is able to then transition into developing the kind of special insight. Or it can be understood as all of the previous teachings, everything that came in the previous 8 chapters, beginning with generating bodhicitta and then engaging in the various practices of generosity and patience and ethics and so forth. So one can understand it in either of these ways, that it's referring to those various kinds of branches, all of those things like generosity and all of the rest of those teachings are taught, are expounded for the sake of being able to generate this wisdom. Or so that's maybe generally the better way to understand it, is that more expansive kind of understanding. Although it's also suitable to see it as all of the branches of the doctrine referring to calm abiding are for this purpose. So here we should understand that in general, to have a direct realization of emptiness, one does not need to engage in all of the various kinds of trainings of, say, a bodhisattva, because one doesn't need to engage in the trainings of the 6 perfections to have a direct realization of emptiness. We've already seen that hearers and solitary realizers also have that direct realization of emptiness, and they are not engaged in these various practices held with an attitude of bodhicitta. So generally, just to give rise to a direct realization of emptiness, one doesn't need to engage in all of those other branches or practices that are infused with bodhicitta. So understanding this as all of the previous branches, as in calm abiding, is a necessary prerequisite to special insight. So, in general, there are different types of bodhisattvas. There are those who first have a realization of emptiness and then later on develop the attitude of bodhicitta. And then there are those who first generate bodhicitta and then go on to develop a realization of emptiness. In particular, like, say, training in the sixfold cause and effect, recalling the kindness of all sentient beings and there having been one's mother and so forth, that is the way in which one is then able to generate bodhicitta, and then following that, maybe give rise to an understanding of emptiness. But the order is not definite. One can have either of these scenarios where someone first realizes emptiness and then generates bodhicitta, or the opposite, wherein someone has generated bodhicitta and later goes on to develop a realization of emptiness. So I think we'll stop there for this evening, as we're short on time.